I should perhaps also thank the people of Rome for giving my country its name. Palestina prima, Palestina secunda. Some of you probably, most of you know that, but we would probably be running around without a name if it wasn't for the Romans. Or maybe we would be called Canaan or Yabus, which means to kiss in Arabic. Not a bad choice. I've been asked to speak about Palestine's Mediterranean identity and the problematic that it raises. Let me start by saying that Palestine shares a lot of cultural attributes with many Levantine social formations. This includes Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, the Balkans, Southern Europe. And these attributes include forms of social organization, bringing together places like Tunis, Algeria, northern part of Egypt, Greater Syria, and of course, many countries in Southern Europe. What are these attributes? They include having an independent peasantry, an agricultural cycle and cropping arrangements typified by crops like vine and the attributes of vineyards, a common cuisine, although if you move from hummus to pasta, you may not realize it's a common cuisine, but it is one. There's a lot of common shared features which are especially felt in the Greater Ottoman cuisine. And there is also a very interesting dynamic, which is the whole antagonism or opposition between the culture of the sea and the culture of the mountain. And some people like to think of it as conservatism versus a libertine culture, but that's not exactly the situation. Before that, there is what the French anthropologist Trion used to call the Republic of Cousins, mainly that among the peasantries of many of these Levantine and Mediterranean countries, there's a preference for endogamy within the father's line, that is one's tendency to marry one's cousin. But the problem, the idea of a Mediterranean identity is very problematic, I think, currently, because in Europe, there is a negative policy-oriented definition of Mediterraneanism, especially in regard to the manner in which Southern Europe defines its relationship to North Africa and the Middle East. And it's seen basically as a security issue. So the idea of common cultural features is seen as a frame for suggesting policies whose objective is to deal with the issue of immigration or to block successive immigration. Within the Barcelona doctrine, for example, there's a lot of investment done to revive economies in the Maghreb especially, but also in Syria, Lebanon, the Middle East, to discourage people from going to Europe. So it's become a negative definition of this Mediterraneanism. But the problem is not only European. Within Syria and Palestine, there is hesitancy to emphasize this connection for a number of reasons, one of which is that it assumes a separate social formation of Palestine from the rest of Bilad al-Sham or Greater Syria. It also assumes certain cultural commonalities between the Syrian littoral, the countries of Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, that separates it from its Arab Islamic affinities, as if we have closer relationship with Greece, the Balkans, France and Italy than we do with our Arab brothers and Islamic cultures around it, in Iran and Turkey. More recently, there is the notion that a Mediterranean identity resurrects a distant Ottoman past, and this happened especially after the AKP came to power, after Erdogan's party came to power, and when Davutoglu began to talk about the language of neo-Ottomanism, which many people, of course, welcome, but many people felt that perhaps we're restoring a past which had been very repressive and retrogressive. Finally, the idea of a Mediterranean identity sometimes is criticized because it colludes with the tendencies within Israel to also search for a common European Mediterranean identity, which is aimed at escaping from its own Arab environment, something which Wasim has alluded to. I think the problem with all of these objections is that it is seeking a form of identity which is exclusive, as if you cannot be Mediterranean and Arab or Mediterranean and Islamic. You cannot be Syrian, Ottoman, and Palestinian at the same time, which of course becomes nonsense only if you go 50, 60, 70 years backward, when we were all Ottomans, we were all Syrians, and then Sykes-Picot came and divided people into their separate little identities. So this exclusivity, I think, is imposed on many of these categories of identity, which we are now trying to escape. But basically, the idea that of a Mediterranean identity suggests that within Palestine and also Lebanon and Syria, there are certain features of culture which brings these Arab societies closer to that of Cyprus, Greece, Turkey, the Balkans, southern France, and southern Italy than it does to adjoining Arabian, Iraqi, Gulfi, Yemeni cultures, which is a very provocative idea, but it has a great deal of truthfulness to it. For example, if you eat, and many of you, I think, eat regularly, you notice that within these cultures, the cuisine is much closer to them than it is between, let's say, Syria, Palestine, and Iraq, or Lebanon and Yemen. The Lebanese cuisine certainly is an Ottoman cuisine, and it has many shared features with Greece, the Balkans, and southern Italy and southern France. So there is a great deal of truthfulness to it, which we should ponder. And I want to suggest this truthfulness by examining the urban modernity of Palestine within certain vignettes, which began with what I call the Ottoman modernity of Palestine. Within Palestine, much of this modernity, which is attributed to the colonial British period, that is to the post-1920s, actually began in the middle of the 19th century with the Ottoman reformations, Tanzimat, and the beginning of purposeful planning of the major urban centers. It also began with heavy investment in the modernity of these cities by both the Western powers, who were seeking a foothold within the Ottoman regime, and by the Ottoman state itself. And in Palestine, one can look at a triadic kind of modernity. That is a modernity that began to appear within three urban areas. Jaffa, which was the literal port city, Jerusalem, the holy city and provincial capital of the province of Jerusalem, and Bir Saba or Bir Sheva, which was the border defense town. A grid of modernity was reinforced through the introduction of electrification, railroad, telegraph system, and modern schooling system. And this began substantially before, at least a century before, the French, British, the Italians, and the Germans came to the Middle East as an occupying power. Of these three modernities, I think Jaffa exhibits the most interesting form of transformation. It came to be known as al-Gharib, which in Arabic means the city of strangers. And the reason for that is because Jaffa is a very modern city. It's an old Philistine city that has been totally destroyed by the plague and the Napoleonic invasion in 1800 and was started from scratch by the Ottoman governor Abu Nabut. And Jaffa, because of its newness, became a city of merchants, citrus planters, and agricultural workers involved with the banana citrus plantations. And that is why it became known as the city of strangers. People came to it from all the neighboring towns, especially from Wasim's ancestral town of Lidda and Ramle, and was built anew. It became emblematic of this new modernity through the grand architecture introduced by the Ottomans in the clock square, the sabils, the grand Saraya building, and the Corniche boulevards, which were established in the time of the governor Hassan Beg. The new plazas became an arenas for a new public sphere. For the first time, there was something akin to the Italian city-states plazas, where people gather not for religious purposes, but for the expression of public agitation, public demonstrations, and political ceremonials. Here we have a picture of Governor Akram Bey addressing the crowds on the occasion of the Constitutional Revolution of 1908, which was known as I'lan al-Hurriya, the Declaration of Freedom, because press censorship, political parties, political associations began to be implemented after that date. It's the entry of mass society in Palestine's most urban center. By contrast, Jerusalem's public sphere evolved from a completely different angle. It was a different trajectory of modernity, one in which these public forms of expression evolved from what I call syncretic modes of religious ceremonials. Sorry to use these terms, but anthropologists like to play with the idea of syncretism. What it means basically is that popular forms of religion, which includes visitation to shrines of prophets like Nabi Musa or Khadr, Saint George, were transformed into secular holidays, or rather into religious holidays in a secular form. And this happened more or less in the second part of the 19th century. We see them accelerated in times of war, when a large number of populations were moved, I'm talking about the First World War, when the railroads built for military expression allowed people to move en masse from one city to another, rediscover the other. Because until then, especially in the peasant areas, but also in towns, people remained most of their life there. They did not move. They moved only on very rare occasions when they wanted to trade or when they wanted to visit a distant relative for ceremonial occasions. All of a sudden, massive people were moving and discovering that they belonged to the same country. Before that, they used to think of themselves as Nabulsis or Lidawis or Jerusalemites. But now they became aware of their Syrian, Palestinian, Arab, Ottoman identity. And this is very important. The idea of nationalism existed in very rudimentary form, but all of a sudden it acquired an organizational expression. We see it in a number of images, and I've become interested recently in photography, how photography can be examined to monitor and survey and detect shifting patterns of dress, style, expression, gender mixture or gender segregation. This is a very interesting photo, rare photo from 1910. It's called A Football Game in Bab al-Zahira. Bab al-Zahira is a gate in Jerusalem's old city, and this is outside the gate. It shows the villas of the new bourgeoisie moving outside of the city walls. And all of a sudden you look, you see on the right tombstone. This is the turbe, or the cemetery of Bab al-Zahra. And then you see men wearing tarbush, men wearing qumbaz, women holding umbrellas. In Arabic, an umbrella is called shamsiyya, which means the instrument that protects you from the sun, because we have more sun than we have rain. So it's shamsiyya, right? So we have women wearing, holding shamsiyyas, dressed in Ottoman European code, but especially mixing, sitting next to men. This is very, very novel idea for the city. Of course, in the countryside, in the villages, you had always men and women working together in the fields. They did not cover their face. I mean, they covered other parts of their body, but their faces went uncovered. And they worked in teams. They were all related to each other. So there was no gender segregation in the countryside. But in the city, there was a highly segregated insular system, which now we begin to see opening up because there is a new public sphere. There's arenas of interaction which is not religious. Football game, amazing. And the men are actually playing in shorts. They're showing their knees and part of their thighs. So this is the football game from 1910. And then we have, this is the celebration of Sitna Maryam in August 15th, is Our Lady, the Virgin. I think August 15th is also in Italy, right? It's the celebration of the Virgin's birthday. It's called Shathat Saad wa Said. I call it bourgeois flaneurism. How do you translate this in Italian? Bourgeois flaneurism. Again, you see men and women, Jews, Christians, and Muslims breaking the communal boundaries and celebrating the Virgin's birthday, but in a totally worldly, I don't say secular, but you can say secular, it's a worldly kind of atmosphere. This is 1919, 1 year after British occupation of the city. And again, the same city, we have a more traditional setup. This is the arrival of the Kiswe from Damascus to Jerusalem's Jaffa Gate. And we have the Mufti of Jerusalem, who is not yet Haj Amin al-Husseini, it's his brother, and moving in procession. And then you look at the crowd, and you see something very interesting. You still see some people who look like Jews, some people who look like Christian clergymen, and some sheikhs with the amame, with the laffe. But you also see many people whose religion you don't know. And this is very interesting because the attributes of style, wearing a certain identification of religion, began to break down with the collapse of communitarian structures and the evolution of the idea of common Ottoman citizenship, where everybody is equal, the capitulations were abolished, the jizya was abolished, the poll tax, and people began to wear some European forms of dress, but also what is called modern Ottoman dress. That is the tarbush, the qumbaz has been removed, they have trousers, they have jackets, and women wearing dresses. So all of these people are mixed together, but because this is a more traditional part of town, you still have a persistence of the old order. And this is very interesting because through these images, you can see almost a litmus test of the transition to modernity in terms of the breakdown of communitarianism, the emergence of a new public culture, and the abolition, or rather the decline of religious ceremonies as the sole period for public ceremonies. People now celebrate football games, they celebrate theatrical expressions, they move in processions in Boy Scouts, and unfortunately they also celebrate the coming of the war, which had a devastating impact on the people. The war had a Janus-type features. It was devastating, but it was also liberating. It allowed people to move in large numbers, meet each other, become aware of its own national boundaries. And the point I'm making here is that the religious ceremonials, which were endemic to Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, certainly Anatolia, Turkey, as the major expression of collective gathering of people, remained celebrated but acquired a synthetic character. For example, Nabi Musa, the holiday of Moses, the Khadr, the birthday of Saint George, and especially in Jaffa, there's a maqam or a shrine to Saint Reuben, who's a Jewish prophet, Nabi Rubin. These became public secular holidays. Everybody went there. Nabi Musa celebrated in the spring, March and April. 8 weeks, people would go. There's a Luna Park, there's a kitchen, public kitchens, and it was a public holiday. Of course, it was a tribute to Moses himself, but the form of expression of identifying Moses first became publicly interreligious, then it became nationalist in character. Rubin is even more interesting because Rubin was a Jewish prophet whose shrine is south of Jaffa, and it was basically a Muslim holiday. Christians and Jews celebrated in it, but it was mostly a Muslim holiday, which was expressed in August. About 40% of the population of Jaffa, which was quite substantial, about 70,000 people, moved to the shrine in August. Not at the same day, of course, it was a whole month, but everything became part of that partaking of public culture. It included even bordellos, which is a bit shocking when you think of that this is a prophet of God, but Jaffas tend to be much more libertine than the rest of the country's population. The third city I want to address is Bir Saba or Bir Sheva, which was planned by the Ottomans. It was the only Ottoman city, modern city introduced to Palestine, was planned as a garrison from a very old town that did not exist anymore except in the form of a Bedouin encampment. And what's interesting about Bir Saba, it was planned from aerial photography. The Ottoman Air Force began to take aerial photography, and it was built like a grid. You can tell from the public square, this is Jamal Pasha's square, the Saraya, the schools. It was built by a man called Raghib Nashishibi, who became mayor of Jerusalem. He was newly graduated from the School of Public Planning Urban Planning in Istanbul University, and came with his cousin Saeed, and they planned the city of Bir Saba as a new city to serve as a bulwark for defense purposes in the southern part of the empire, not only south of Palestine, but south of the Ottoman Empire, against intrusions by the British from Suez. So it became very important during the war as the defensive shield of the empire. At the same time, the coastal cities that I spoke about, Haifa, Akka, Jaffa, became the areas of intensive settlement by European colonialism, by Jewish settlers and German settlers. We sometimes forget, why am I having this? I'm being translated to myself. I thought there was something wrong with me. I was hearing myself twice. So the same area which showed this Ottoman modernity and opening up and breaking down of confessional ideological boundaries became the same area of contestation by European settler colonialism. We forget that the Germans and the Jews arrived more or less at the same time. Now, of course, inland, there was ancient Jewish communities in Safad, Tabariya, Jerusalem, and Hebron, which is what my colleague Wasim talked about. These were the indigenous Syrian, Arab, Sephardic, pietistic Jewish communities living inside. But on the coast, you have the European settlers, first Germans and then Jews, and they began to contest the same territory as the area of the Arab urban modernities in Haifa and Jaffa. So what we have is not a conflict, as sometimes it is exposed by scholars, between traditionalism and modernity, Arabs and Jews, but between two forms of modernities. One, Syrian, Ottoman, nativistic modernity, which involved a substantial amount of urban planning, creation of public sphere, and the European form of modernity, which you see in the Bauhaus introductions in Tel Aviv, in Herzliya, in the Jewish colonies, but also in the German colonies of Tabariya, Haifa, Jaffa, and Jerusalem. You have German colonies more or less introducing European forms of building, use of public space, as the Zionists did. So two forms of contested modernities. And with the War of 48, this is not a history lecture. I'm just trying to examine how these modernities transformed the system and were transformed by it. So with the War of 48, one of the major tragedies which hit the Palestinians, which is not really what, when we talk about the Nakba, we think of refugees, of this dismemberment of a nation. But one features of the War of 48 was the destruction of these coastal cities and their modernity, and the clearing of their population into the inland and into the diaspora. So it dismembered the mercantile urban culture and created a nation of dispersed refugees. And that destruction is peculiarly Palestinian. Of course, there was much devastation that happened in Izmir, in Greece, in the Armenian areas at the same time. But what happened here is a total transplantation of these modern cities, not into other cities, but into the diaspora. They were atomized, they became part of an exiled nation. And that's a very important feature of the destruction of the urban modernist culture, which was created first by the Ottomans and then through the Mandate period in Palestine. It happened in Syria and Lebanon, of course, but that transplantation did not occur. In Lebanon and Syria, you have exiled community. They were self-exiled. They were part of the Lebanese diaspora in Brazil and Mexico and in North America, and as well as in Europe. but there was a voluntary kind of migration which you see in all other countries. Here we have a systematic destruction of that urban culture, which was recreated in a very distorted, atomized form abroad. And this is my conclusion. I say, the resolution of the Arab-Israeli conflict in territorial terms, that is, the coexistence of an Israeli Occidental state with the remnants of a Palestinian Mediterranean society, may happen at the expense of its diasporic community. Now, the dispersed refugee diaspora, as you know, has been integrated into a number of urban cultures in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, but mostly in the Gulf countries. They're integrated economically. They do not have citizenship, except maybe in Jordan, but they have been part of another urban formations. The non-resolution of the conflict in territorial terms, which is the subject of the current negotiations and the ongoing contestation of territory in Israel and the occupied territories. The non-resolution of the conflict in territorial terms is likely to prolong not only the conflict, but also to create two Palestinian nations. That is, if there is no solution, which is quite likely, we have an occupied Mediterranean society, which is the West Bank and Gaza, and a dispersed nation of exiles whose rhetoric, aspirations, and outlook will echo the example of the Armenian exile. Thank you.